1-2. 1-2.
Good afternoon. I want to thank everybody who joins us here in Ukraine Media Center Ukrinform. My name is Oleh. It's year 9 of the war and day 321 of the heroic resistance of the Ukrainian people, and I want to traditionally thank all the representatives of all the mass media who tell the world the truth about this war. A brief schedule of briefings for today is as follows. At 1500, joining us will be Alexander Harchenko, director at the Energy Industry Research Center, and we will be talking about the current situation in the power grid of Ukraine. At 1600, joining us will be Andrei Demchenko, spokesperson of the State Border Guard Service of Ukraine, and we will be talking about the situation in our borders. And joining us right now in this studio is Oleh Korikov, acting chairman, the chief state inspector for nuclear and radiation safety of Ukraine. Mr. Oleh, please welcome to this scene, and let's start our conversation with the situation in Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. What's the state of operation of the plant? We know that lately the occupiers are trying, and they keep telling us that they're trying to get it connected to the Russian power grid. Did they make it, and what would be the consequences of such reconnection? Thank you for your question. As of today, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant turned from the generator of the electric power into a consumer of electric power. It all happens due to the capturing of the power plant by the Russian occupiers. All the 6 power blocks are stopped. However, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant keeps receiving the electric power from the Ukrainian power grid. It requires electric power for operation of the safety systems, specifically those that provide the residual heat release from the power plant. During the occupation of the nuclear power plant, there is we observe a huge degradation of the safety and security system. The presence of the Russian personnel and material, the explosive materials, has nothing in common with compliance with the requirements of the nuclear safety. The occupiers, in fact, turned the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant into a repair base, into a military base, so that they repair the vehicles over there and other military material at the facilities of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. We have to say that those actions of transforming of nuclear power plant into a military base are absolutely unacceptable, and obviously the only operating organization is the state power atomic power generating company Energoatom, the Ukrainian state company. What's happening now is an illegitimate attempts to appoint the fake operating organization by the decree of Putin, and that operating organization is not recognized by neither country, and those resolutions, those decrees are in fact null and void. And the only legitimate operating organization is the, as I mentioned, Ukrainian state enterprise Energoatom, which has a proper process for training of the personnel, and which is properly licensed. We as Energoatom have the license for operating of the all nuclear power blocks and the shelter for processed nuclear fuel. we also have the licensing system in place in Ukraine for relevant personnel. So those are the two very important components. First of all, the licensing of personnel, which is entitled to directly operate the reactor, and the top management personnel who are entitled to exercise their functions related to nuclear safety. However, all that personnel is being hired by state organization Energoatom, which trains and licenses the personnel for further work in the nuclear power plant, and I represent this organization. So the pertinence of the personnel to Energoatom and their status of a licensed personnel is the only legal way of management and operation of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Any other options are beyond the legal field. Now the representatives of Rosatom are staying at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant on illegal basis. They try to interfere the technological process of operation of Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, and as I mentioned, those actions are absolutely illegitimate, and those so-called specialists who arrived to operate the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, they have to remember that they will bear personal liability for that. And moreover, they may end up under sanctions, under personal sanctions. I mean, this personnel, let alone they will lose their professional reputation among our professional community of the nuclear power plant operators. As to the attempts to get the Zaporizhzhia power plant connected to the Russian power grid, what would be the consequences of such connection? Thank you. I appreciate this question. As to the possibility of connecting the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant to Russian power grid, we were already witnessing those attempts, and such attempts ended with nothing. So I'm convinced that any further attempts of the occupiers to, in fact, to steal the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant from us and the electric power that it may generate will end with nothing. Moreover, the international organizations, the United Nations Organization and AEAE, in their resolutions regarding the situation in Ukraine, multiple times reiterated that the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is the property of Ukraine and the electric power generated by it is also Ukrainian. Well, you mentioned international organizations, including IEAE. We hear a lot from different sources, including IEAE, about their attempts to create the safety zone around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Is there any understanding today? Were they able to make it? Are there any success in this direction? Thank you for your question. It's a very important subject, in fact. International participation and the role of international organizations in the nuclear safety is quite important. It's critical. First of all, I would like to say that everything that's going on in Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is going on in front of the permanent surveillance and monitoring mission by IEAE that stay on the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant on a permanent basis, and even they cannot influence the actions of the occupiers who keeps infringing the nuclear safety. Ukraine, we invited to set up a monitoring mission by IEAE in all other nuclear power plant, including Chernobyl nuclear power plant. IEAE agreed to this proposal, and shortly such missions are about to be deployed in all the Ukrainian nuclear power plants, and the main task of these missions is the monitoring of the nuclear safety under the conditions of the influence inflicted by war on Ukrainian nuclear power plants. Respectively, IEAE may operate in a real-time mode. They may be the real-time witness of what's really going on, how those missile strikes that we suffered on, for example, 23rd of November, when all the blocks of the nuclear power plants of Ukraine were shut down due to safety mode after the attack of the Russian occupiers on the Ukrainian power grid. In this way, IEAE will arrive shortly, and they will have a representation in all the nuclear power plants of Ukraine. As to the negotiations that are being going on by Rafael Emiliano Grossi, the Director General of IEAE, regarding the safety zone around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Really, there is such information, and these negotiations are still in progress. The meetings are going on, both in Moscow, even in Moscow, and us. I mean, Ukraine, we come up with the proposal that the safety zone should be created based on the conditions of demilitarization, complete deoccupation of the territory of Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant and around it, including the town of Energodar, and bringing it back under control of Ukrainian government. So based on these conditions, this is how Ukraine understands this safety zone. We submitted our proposals to Mr. Rafael Grossi, and the Director General of IEAE. During negotiation, he bases his statements on the Ukrainian position. So the current condition of the negotiations is that I would say it's a diplomatic policy, it's a sensitive issue, and that's why it's a little bit beyond our competence. So we expect from our colleagues from IEAE, we can only wish them success in these negotiations. Well, talking about the operation of our nuclear power plants, is the electric power generated by them sufficient? Is it enough to cover the needs of the Ukrainian consumers? Thank you for the question. Currently, in the territory controlled by the Ukrainian government, there are 9 blocks of nuclear power plants being operated, 8 of which work on full capacity, and 1 is under scheduled maintenance. All 6 blocks of Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant are shut down currently, and the Russians don't allow to bring the nuclear power plant blocks to the level of operations which would be required to cover the needs of the Ukrainian consumers. So all the other blocks of nuclear power plants are being used to their maximum capacity. How does it cover the needs of Ukrainian consumers I would say, in percentage? We're looking for other sources. For example, do we cover our requirements at least for 50%? Well, lately the nuclear power plants cover more than 50% of the consumption of the electric power in Ukraine, and for the time being the situation is more or less like this, a little bit more than 50%. We know that the tactics of Russia is lately the shelling of our power grid capacities, power grid facilities, and we witnessed our electric power stations being shut down in safety modes. Can you please tell us about this process? How does it happen actually, this emergency shutdown, and what are the consequences of such emergency shutdowns? I'm reminding you that on the 23rd of November last year, we had a situation when after another a missile strike by Russia on our electric power grid facilities, there was a partial emergency shutdown, which resulted in shutdown of all the blocks of nuclear power plants in safety mode, all of them without exclusion. All of the power blocks were switched to power consumption, of electric power generated by the reserve capacities by the electric power generators. That is the project mode contemplated by the maintenance schedules and the operation schedules for a short period until the grid was brought back to the condition when it was ready to receive the power generated by the nuclear power plant. But as soon as the operation of the whole power grid was resumed, the nuclear power plant blocks were switched back on and reconnected to the system, and their generating capacity was reestablished. So this is how it's happening when the electric power grid is incapable of receiving the generated electric power. The nuclear power plant blocks, they have to be stopped, they have to be shut down, but that's a normal scheduled process, and which is being trained, which is being exercised during the trainings. This is how actually the personnel gets licensed and trained for operation of the nuclear power plant. We can state that any emergency shutdown may be the cause for development of an emergency situation, and it requires further calculations and further study and research. But our power blocks are absolutely resilient, and the situation that we had on the 23rd of November, we worked it through with all of our personnel, with the power technicians, and it in fact should not have some significant impact on the power grid and the operation of the nuclear power plants in Ukraine. Dear colleagues, if you have any questions, please introduce yourself. Good afternoon, Yana Koloda, Ukrinform. My question is as follows: in your opinion, do you think that the 10th package of sanctions may contain the sanctions against Rosatom and the nuclear energy sector of Russian Federation? I would thank you for your question. I would like to start my answer with the fact that the international organizations that we cooperate with in terms of utilization of nuclear energy, I mean the United Nations Organization and IAEA, they reiterated their stance multiple times regarding the facts of the armed attack, armed offense, and unprovoked aggression of Russian Federation and capturing of the facilities of the nuclear power plants in Ukraine. We have the resolutions of the management councils approved in March, September, and November 2022 that Russia has to cease these actions against nuclear power plants and nuclear power plant facilities of Ukraine, and they have to leave those facilities and leave Ukraine within the borders recognized as of 1991. We cooperated with our colleagues from Ministry of Foreign Affairs and in international organizations, and there we discussed the sanctions against the international projects developed by Rosatom, and now there is already a regulating body in Russian Federation, and the sanctions should be imposed against it as well. So forecasting those sanctions contained in the 10th package of sanctions, I cannot say so, but the relevant work in this regard, we are very active in this work. I would like to detailize. You're talking about the year 2022, right? More questions? Vyacheslav Kosintsev, you mentioned that Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant cannot generate the electric power to Ukrainian power grid, but does it have such a physical capacity? Is it still connected to Ukrainian power grid? And if there is such a resolution being taken, could it provide power for the Ukrainian power grid? And the second question, how many of the Ukrainian personnel are left on the Zaporizhzhia power plant, and was the number of Russians who came to so to say to operate the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant? Yes, Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is currently connected to the Ukrainian power grid, and it can electric power for the release of the residual heat. And now there is a technical capacity for providing the electric power to Ukrainian power grid, but the launch of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is being blocked by the occupiers. As to the personnel, we have significant decrease of our personnel in Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which is a result of the jeopardy the occupiers put those people in, and the whole territory of the nuclear power plant. I mean the tortures, I mean the pressure, psychological pressure, which the occupiers used to appropriate the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. But the number of Ukrainian personnel, including the licensed personnel in Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, is quite sufficient to ensure the safe operation of Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in its current operating mode. And as to the presence of the Russians, well, it's difficult to tell you exact figures, but we can say for sure there is presence of Russians. We may state that it's absolutely illegal, and they will end up under personal sanctions because we have a list of them. We keep identifying them. The identification is still in progress by the relevant law enforcement agencies of Ukraine. So it's just a matter of time. It's not going to end well for them. Thank you. Are there any more questions in the studio, dear friends? Well, now that we don't have any more questions, I want to thank you for joining us in this studio. I'm reminding you, joining us was Oleh Korikov, acting chairman of Держатомрегулювання, and our next briefing is at 1500, so bear with us and trust in our armed forces, and glory to Ukraine. Thank you for your kind invitation.